So it's Friday the 13th, and I thought it would be a good time to talk about something having to do with that franchise that I haven't dipped into that much. Fan films. In case you're not familiar with them, fan films are just that. Movies made by fans about a property that they love but don't have the rights to. Most companies turn a blind eye to them as long as the filmmakers aren't making a profit off of it. So most of these movies are online and free to watch, and there's a ton of Friday the 13th related ones. So I thought that we'd take a look at some of them and try to figure out where on the timeline that they fit. Our first entry here is from 2021, and it's called Vorhees, Night of the Beast. And it's in Crystal Lake, and Jason is here, resembling his Part 7 look. And the kid says the thing.
So, what did you want to be when you grew up?
And it's just a dream, and apparently Mark was that kid from Part 6, now grown up. His girlfriend is upset that he can't sleep. So they want to have an intervention by taking him to the lake. And man, did she even say it out loud and realize what a garbage idea that is. Then there's a group of people getting ready for action, including someone that looks pretty familiar, if not younger. And now that I think about it, if Mark is meant to be that kid and he's around 10 years old, then I guess that this is meant to be around 10 years after Part 6. So like sometime in the 90s, they meet Guy, Eddie, and he warns them away like Crazy Ralph, and they keep calling him Old Man and Old Timer. And sure, this guy is not a teenager, but Old Timer? They say that he's Ralph's cousin, and hey, bling up your day? Not quite the 90s then. Mark soon finds out where they are, and one of the crew is Jessa Flux early on in her career. And yeah, in case you missed it, this guy is meant to be Creighton Duke, which I suppose makes sense if this is in between 7 and 9, although there's a distinct age difference, especially if this is meant to be around a decade after 6. His mentor here used to work with Pamela back in 1957, and they dip into the whole Jason is a product of the Necronomicon thing, and like, I think he was meant to be like 18 or something in 1957, so he's, what, 60? He says that Jason has been haunting Crystal Lake around for the past 10 years. Again, I don't get the time frame on this at all, but I'm not really going to stress all that because here's where things take a turn. Seems that Jason isn't the only thing around, since there's also a Bigfoot on the prowl killing folk. But so is Mr. V, and this cop says he thinks that all the killings are copycats inspired by Roy, and mentions Forest Green, so we're post 7, and then Manhattan, so we're post 8, so I guess that this is set between 8 and 9, and this was both written and directed by Jason Pitts, and is around an hour long. And when we get a better look at Jason, it's very clearly the post 7 version with that same mask, which is hard to reconcile with knowing that this is after Part 8. Although beyond that, you can fairly comfortably fit this between that movie and Jason Goes to Hell. This also says that Jason is under the sway of the demon Asmodeus, the demon of lust. We got a small sequel in 2023 with a 20-minute short called Vorhees After the Beast that picks up a week after the first one, and the sister of one of the girls from that hires Duke. And even though this is only a week later, he's got a pretty drastically different look. We hilariously find out that Jason survived being torn apart by the Bigfoot by the Jason Goes to Hell method, and a Bigfoot ate his heart and for some reason transforms into another Jason. And this one is closer to the Part 9 look, so I guess bridges that gap, although it doesn't explain what happened to the Part 8 look. Also in 2021, there was one called Roseblood, a Friday the 13th fan film. And this one clearly is a little higher budgeted, since it starts with Tina herself from Part 7, again played by Lar Park Lincoln, and she's still haunted by Dr. Cruz. Also, again, Terry Kaiser, although he's pretty unrecognizable here. She says that he's been dead for 30 years, so this is meant to be 30 years after part 7, and there's a flashback to 1989 with a younger Tina played by a different actress. And this is meant to be after the 7th film, so they're putting that one pre-June 1989, which just does not work with the series timeline, but that's not really important here. This ain't no timeline video. They're doing tests on her, and she says that it's over a year since her encounter with Jason, so they're putting that one in 1988, which is the year that it came out, although there's no way that that's when it was set. And there's yet another younger version of Creighton Duke on hand, and he has another old book, but I don't think that this is meant to be the Necronomicon. She's being held in a research facility, and they bring in another young girl who also has powers, and it turns out that they're just using Tina. It seems that they want to find Jason and use her powers to control him, and then replicate his regenerative abilities. They found his gear, including the mask, which they said that they put back together with crazy glue. They keep on making sure that everyone knows that it's supposed to be the 80s because everyone constantly mentions pop culture. And after what seems like an inordinately long time, Jason finally shows up after an hour and 5 minutes of people in white-walled rooms talking. It's the part 7 version again, and he goes into action, and then for whatever reason, Michael Myers shows up. I really have no idea why he's here, but he just is. But then there's time travel involved in part 7's Nick, once again by Kevin Spiritus, so I guess he and Lincoln made up at some point. And this one was written and directed by Peter Anthony, who also plays General Brackbauer in the film, and he's made several other Friday fan films along the way, and we'll check back with him in a little bit. And the ending of this one sort of banishes Jason somewhere, although it's not said where, which does complicate things continuity-wise if they want this to bridge into part 8. The next one is from 2020, a year in which Jason wearing a mask actually makes sense. And we're following 2 women, and one is visiting her father's grave, and her friend are attacked. Turns out that they're kidnapped by a crew of criminals, but, I should mention that the big problem with the whole lot of fan films is that they're usually, every cast member just ends up looking like everyone's classmates. Anyway, after some fighting, the big guy wakes up and emerges from the middle of the lake while one of the girls escapes. She doesn't get far though because Jason catches her first and kills her. And this one looks mostly like remake Jason, although without the long tufts of hair. When they find some news headlines about the camp, this guy says that a kid drowned some years ago back, and meanwhile, there's a couple of corrupt cops on the Crooks Trail with possibly the least believable hats around. And yeah, when Mr. V finally appears a little more clearly, it's apparent that he's meant to look like the 2009 version, although that doesn't totally make sense. But it doesn't really have to. This one can be clear of any other continuities, and it could reasonably be a follow-up to the remake, although later on, we see his mother's head, and it's clearly the version from part 2. At one point, they mentioned Westfield, so it's tied in a way to the Elm Street universe, especially since earlier they said that a character worked at the Elm Street Bank. But this is the first one on here that doesn't really try to tie itself into the main franchise with plots and characters, and instead is set at a nebulous time frame with a nebulous Jason. It was by Cody Falk, and this was the only feature-length production he's done, and it looks like he's currently at work on a Crow fan film. At an hour and 39 minutes, it's the longest one so far, and we do get a face reveal, and it's very much Zombie Jason, so not the remake version. And this one ends with Jason still on the loose, so it's somewhat freestanding in terms of where this one takes place. Let's go now to one from 2021, and it's called Jason Rising, a Friday the 13th fan film. And the opening appears to show us a dead Jason. It says he's returned to Crystal Lake in 1984, talking about the long weekend that stretches from parts 2 to 4, and says that Tommy Jarvis killed him. But that wasn't the end. And, duh. A couple of officers are charged with transferring the big guy's dead body. And why would they put the mask back on him? As expected, though, he still has some fight in him, but they bury him 6 feet down. Time passes, and the new local sheriff is Pete, and it turns out that a bunch of convicts have escaped and are on the run. And based on cars and a modern Fango cover, this is modern times, so I guess it's 40 years after the intro? The convicts end up taking refuge in the camp, and they recap Jason's story, saying that his body is still buried out there, which means that this is picking up after part 4 and ignoring any of the other entries. A zombie headless Pamela then comes to life and finds out where our dude is and drags him out of the ground, and for not having a head, this thing gets around pretty well. Jason wakes up and he's still sporting that classic style from parts 3 and 4. This girl clearly hasn't seen that first movie because she heads out on a canoe, and there's several officers out looking for the girls. And I should point out that in Roseblood, there's a large black military guy, and he has a gun named Betsy. And this movie has a large black policeman with a gun named Betty. So is that a trope or something? But things take a turn here when Pamela becomes a full-on secondary villain, and we get a return of another classic Friday cast member as Adrienne King returns as Alice, which is a bit tricky with the continuity since they don't explain how she survived to the beginning of part 2, so it's clear that things happened differently in this timeline. There's also a mini cameo from Amy Steele as Ginny, and this one was by a man named James Sweet, and was the first thing that he's directed, and IMDb shows it as having a $50K budget. Here's another one from 2020, and this one is a little shorter, and it's Friday the 13th, Death Curse. It begins with a massacre and Pamela talking to the big dude, and then there's this guy named Michael. He goes to visit his mom and talks about his uncle Lewis. So I hope he doesn't also own an antique shop. But he's actually bought Crystal Lake, and Michael heads up there. Meanwhile, Mom has Ginny's picture in a locket, but then I guess Unks is killed. Jason shows up and does some killing, and I should mention that everyone has these really thick accents because this was shot in South Africa, but I think it's meant to be Jersey or wherever they're saying Crystal Lake is nowadays. There's a bunch of news clippings, and Ginny is in one of them, and Michael recognizes her, but then he shows up, and based on the skin tone and outfit, this appears to be Freddy vs. Jason era. So this is likely set after that one, with Jason simply returning to the camp. I said that this was shorter than the others since it only runs just over 20 minutes and was directed by a guy named Johnny Styles. And he also plays Michael in the movie. And IMDb says that the estimated budget was only $100, which is pretty impressive. But probably the weirdest thing about it is just the whole Ginny thing isn't really explained. I think it's possible that they're hinting that she was Michael's sister or something based on how the mother was looking at the pendant. But that doesn't really make sense with everyone's ages as well as the accents. Here's yet another from 2020, a popular year for Friday fan films, and this one is called Camp Forest Green. This has a group of young folk headed out to a party in a cabin, and they're an assortment of stereotypes, but really, I'm pretty sure they're designed to be like that, with a stoner, a surfer, country boy, etc. They're all lakeside, and there's a good amount of time spent to setting up their partying. But then this guy says that it's Camp Forest Green, and it's formerly known as Crystal Lake. So I guess it's set between parts 6 and 7? Based on everyone's manner of dress, it's possible that this is meant to take place in the 80s, and the lack of cell phones would make that seem right. And I should point out that this is also shorter than the others, but a little longer than that last one, since it's just under a half hour. But the thing is that this is about 16 minutes in, more than halfway through, and except for a pre-credits bit, there's no Jason or even hints that he's around. Finally, though, he starts the attacks, and when we get a good look at him, it's clear that he's not a specific version. His outfit is not something that we've seen before. but the mask is totally different. I guess it's closer to Roy's look than anything else, since it has the blue chevrons on it, which really puts the time frame of this one into question. It's pretty clear that director Christopher Greffrath is a Giallo fan and makes use of some colored gels to give it a Suspiria look. And in terms of time frame, this is probably the most open-ended of any of them so far. The only hint of the time frame is the insinuation that this is the 80s and it's called Camp Forest Green. So this could be set between 6 and 7. But then Jason would be stuck at the bottom of the lake, and in this movie he's just walking around free. So it seems to be a sort of alternate continuity. Let's check out this one now from 2022, and it's called Victim No More. And we're set in New York City, and based on the buildings and billboards and such, it's in modern times. And then there's a guy seeing a psychiatrist, and she's Dr. Cynthia Romero, and it's Jill Whitlow. So I guess that Cynthia and Chris got married, and that parasite from the dog didn't get her after all. Robbie here is seeking counseling, and he talks about his parents going through a traumatic experience, and he thinks that he can help his mom move on. He says that he needs to go to Crystal Lake to do this, and we go back to those classic locations. And a couple of hikers go through the series of murders from the area and basically recap the movies. And they argue for a minute about whether Part 5 was actually Jason or a copycat, and a Part 4 Jason pops out of the woods. But it's just a prank. But then there's a real Jason coming out of the lake, and it appears to be straight out of Part 7 based on the exposed spinal column. And he kills the prankster. Instead of taking his hockey mask, actually eyes up that sack. And sure enough, he starts the killing, looking like a throwback to Part 2, but with that Part 7 body. But Robbie is on hand as well. His mom is upset that he went to the lake, and she says she's coming there, so who will get to him first? Jason or his mystery mum? And this is another one that's not quite feature length, but it's a good 40 minutes long, and is directed by Bob Heckman. And it looks like at one point he was connected to Chris Seaver's outfit, so he knows about low-budget film. But this is the first one that he's directed on his own. Although, I have to say, for a first-time gig, it looks really nice and could easily pass for a mainstream low-budget flick as opposed to a fan film. There's also a cameo from Catherine Mary Stewart playing a character named Megan Jarvis, and it's said that Robbie's last name is Mahoney, and there's this character named Amanda Shepard, which was Tina's mom's name from Part 7, so this may be meant to be Tina's daughter, and a whole crew of what is likely children of past survivors. Plus, there's a quick voiceover from Amy Steele as Ginny, or as I guess just like an omniscient narrator, and another voice cameo by Kimberly Beck as Trish Jarvis, Tommy's sister. So it's got several classic cast members, even if it's just their voiceovers. But then, yeah, cameos from actors from other franchises. I feel like most of these have been pretty recent, so let's look at one that went a bit further back and check out 2010's Friday the 13th, No Man's Land. It has a woman in a room talking about how a monster killed all of her friends and she got away, and says that happened back in 1982. And you'll notice right away that she also has an accent. Then there's a couple of teens camping in a tent, and they also have thick accents. And it's because this one is from England as opposed to New Jersey. They talk about the stories of Jason, and he scares her with a hockey mask because the big guy needs to get one somewhere, right? Like clockwork, he appears and does the murdery thing, and there's a group headed out on a weekend trip. We hang with them for a little bit, but then our man starts to death, and he looks to be a throwback to the classic version as opposed to a zombie type. But then it gets confusing because there's a crazy Ralph kind of guy, and he literally dresses and acts exactly like Ralph. And then this guy says that he saw a case film on America. So is that indicating that this is not meant to be in the US? This guy says that Jason was supposed to be in New York years back, so it's definitely set post Part 8 and in modern day. But I'm not sure if they're meant to be in England or the US. They recap the films, and then he comes in on the attack, and yeah, he's a very human-looking Jason. Clearly not the zombie Jason of later. Then, the placement of this is even more in question when this woman claims to have been a friend of Jason's mother, and I suppose she could just be lying, but she's like maybe 40s-ish. And if this is in modern times, she would have been born around the time that Pamela died, so I guess she's bluffing. And this was by David Hastings, and he did several fan films, although the others look to be Halloween oriented, and this is a little longer than the last few, at just under an hour. And there's no budget listed, but it appears to be pretty low. We're going to move on now into some of the more known ones, and this is from 2019, and it's Friday the 13th, Vengeance. Someone's visiting the graves of Pamela and Jason, and the gravedigger is Tom McLaughlin, the director of Part 6, and the man is revealed to be Jason's dad. And fun fact, this scene was meant to be something that they did at the ending of Jason Lives, but ended up not shooting. Also, Elias is played by CJ Graham, who played Jason in Part 6, so there's some real love for that entry going on. We see that the big guy is still at the bottom of the lake, chained up, but horny teens wake him up. He gets out, starts some chop-chop. He's got the look of Part 6, so it appears likely that this is meant to be a direct follow-up to that one, and ignoring anything after it. But since it looks like modern times, it's probably that he's been down in the lake for around 30 years or so by this point. We then meet a young girl named Ashley Jarvis, and her older sister and their parents are divorced. Darcy the male girl is here, as is Part 2 Jason, Steve Dash, and it turns out that the girl's dad is actually Tommy Jarvis, and he's gone missing, leaving a note saying that Jason is back. There's a small role for Calvin Morier McCarthy, director of several films I've featured, including Amityville Poltergeist and A Nice Guy in general, and they're giving tours of the Crystal Lake area as a local attraction. But the real deal shows up and starts the business. Turns out that Elias is just as much of a psychopath as his kid, and there's a collection of teens whose parents all survived Jason attacks and look to be like the children of Ginny from Part 2. Again, another Higgins kid from Part 3's Chris. Oh, and also a Dr. Cruz, and it's likely that she's connected to the doc from Part 7. Although in this universe, that guy never met Mr. Vorhees. Although a little later, they say that there's sightings of Jason in New York, but they say that that didn't happen and that it was just a story. And this is one of the more polished looking entries so far and could easily pass as an actual entry of the series. It was directed by Jeremy W. Brown and Dustin Monteith. At the time, it was one of the most successful Kickstarter campaigns ever and raised up around $50,000 and became one of the more known of the fan film universe. Meanwhile, this gets into the backstory stuff and eventually provides an explanation as to why Pamela didn't know that Jason didn't drown in the lake. It ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, and I will point out that at one point they're looking at multiple death certificates for Elias, and it says that he was born in 1922. And one of the certificates is from Chadsford, PA, which is a tiny town that I used to go to a lot because my ex is from there, and it's weird to see it mentioned. So then, in 2022, there was a follow-up to that one called Friday the 13th, Vengeance 2, Bloodlines, and it picks up exactly where the last one left off. And it said that he gave Jason that bag on his head and had him go kill in an effort to restore Pamela to life. Angelica and Ashley are both back, and they're both still on the hunt for their pops. And there's also a group of randos that are up in the lake area, and it said that it's a year later now. And you don't have to be a fortune teller to guess that Jason's going to show up and start killing again. And he does. For some reason, even though they know what happened the year before and know that the killer is still out there, when the Jarvis girls try to get the police involved and say that Jason is back, they don't really believe them or take action. Tom McLaughlin returns with a bigger role here, and Pam's head makes an appearance. And Elias has Ashley kidnapped in order to kick off a confrontation with the entire Jarvis clan. But Then there's a confusing bit as Nikki Parsley shows up, a character from Part 6, once again played Darcy DeMoss, and otherwise known as the girl who had her face mashed into the side of an RV and killed. Like, they showed them hauling off her dead body, but here she is back to life again, and it's confusing because she doesn't even mention being there, and the similarity of the situation, especially since she's back in an RV. But then, later, she says that she did have that encounter and had to have surgery in order to fix her face. But, like, she's just mentioning all this now? And this one didn't have Brown and Montiers return to direct and was instead both co-written and directed by Jason Brooks. And he also plays Jason in this film. And he also played Jason in the last one. And in Rose Red. So this guy is like fan film Kane Hodder for being Jason. And this is one of the longest ones on here, at a little over an hour and 45 minutes. And yeah, it's perhaps too long. It does work in a Tom Matthews appearance, because if you've been wondering for 2 movies now if this thing about the Jarvis girls was ever going to actually feature the dad, the answer is yes. So these final 3 are perhaps the most famous of the bunch, and it kicks off with 2017's Never Hike Alone. It has Kyle here going up on a hiking expedition and recording it for a blog. When he sets up the camp for the night, he hears some spooky stuff outside, like coyotes attacking something and perhaps biting off more that they can chew. Along the way, he finds a no trespassing sign and says that the land was donated to a wildlife preserve, but doesn't know about Jason, which is a fine tactic, but like, maybe they should let people know about it? Like, I get the idea that they wanted to section off Crystal Lake since Jason doesn't seem to bug people that don't come onto his land, but maybe tell people so that they don't just stroll in anyway. He finds the camp sign and then the remnants of the old buildings, and there's police evidence tags that show the locations of the deaths in the original film. When he realizes what it all is, he reiterates the story and tells of Jason's origins and the first movie, and then vaguely the rest of the series, but doesn't get into details, so it's unclear if this is ignoring any continuity. He finds sign that Jason has been living in the camp and is then confronted by the big fella, and he sort of has a parts 3 and 4 look about him, although he has a different mask. It's missing the axe notch from part 3 and doesn't have the red chevrons. He definitely has the zombie skin though, and is unkillable, and this version has been dubbed Ghost Jason, and they're claimed that it's directly linked to the Paramount era continuity, which means that it ignores the New Line entries, so this would only take into account parts 1 through 8. There's an unmasking moment, and when it happens, it's very clearly a later stage version with zombified face, and this one is just under an hour. It was by Vicente DeSante, who also plays Jason in it. It was made for a little less than 20 grand and has earned a reputation as being the best Friday fan film going, and has even earned some mentions in a few of the official games. And once again, look for a cameo by Tom Matthews, appearing as Tommy Jarvis, giving that extra air of officialness. They followed that up a few years later in 2020 with a sort of sequel. I guess it was like more of an addendum, called Never Hike in the Snow. You see, since nearly every single Friday film takes place in the summer, but it's in the Northeast, you'd never got to see Jason operate in a winter climate, and fans have continually said that this would be a great thing to see. So this one gives it to you. We start with a guy running from Mr. V in a snowy environment, and he gets taken out, and the police investigate. But of course, Tommy's on hand as well. And they have to tell the mother of the kid from the beginning that her son is missing. She does a little research on the area where he vanished, and we get to see Jace back home, and Mommy's head is still there, kicking off some hallucinations. Tommy and the cops butt heads, and he tries to take care of business, and the sheriff is played by Vincent Guastafaro, and he's reprising his role of Cologne from Friday 6, otherwise known as the Bang, You Dead guy. They find an old mask with the blue stripes on it, and it's pretty short at around a half hour and doesn't really do a whole lot to advance the story and is more of a setup to the sequel. It was at one point edited into Never Hike Alone, and that version was referred to as the Ghost Cut, and it was also solidly popular. This one was said to have had a heftier price tag of around $100,000, a substantial jump from the first one. That takes us to our final stop on this journey, and it's the follow-up to that one, 2023's Never Hike Alone 2. It has a kid fishing by the lake, and it turns out that he's Tommy Jarvis's son, and he has no daughters because this is clearly a different continuity than Vengeance. But that's just a dream, and he doesn't have a son, and it was actually himself as a younger kid, although this is no Feldman, and I don't know if that's good news or bad news for this young actor. He has a crazy person board, and it's full of Easter eggs like Ginny's name and Pam from Part 5, Alice's name, the word Revenant, a news report for the missing kid from Never Hike in the Snow, the blue chevron mask, a news article confirming Part 8 happened, and stuff about other victims. He's intent on facing off against JV, much to the chagrin of Cologne, who's here again, as is Kyle, as this is meant to take place before the first film. And the mom from Snow is here too. But then, the events catch up to that one, and we get that finale again, this time from Tommy's point of view. It then continues where that left off, and with Jason still on the attack, and they return to the hospital where Dr. Hill is as well. This one introduces the concept that Jason is tied to the lake through his mother, and that his ghost form appeared there right after her death, and said that if her head is destroyed, his connection will be also, and he can be defeated. And this featured the return of most of the cast and crew from the other films, and had a healthy-sized budget, even if it doesn't look to be reported anywhere. The Indiegogo for it raised up over $300K, so it cost more than the previous two combined. And if you're looking for a knockdown drag-out between Tommy and Jason, you're gonna get it. There also seems to be another entry in the works, as DeSanti is currently working towards a Part 3 entitled Never Hike Alone 3, Jason Takes Crystal Lake, and has announced intentions to do a fourth part called The Final Hike. Meanwhile, look for a cameo here by Shelley himself, Larry Zerner, as the town mayor. So there you have it, 13 Friday the 13th fan films on the day itself. Yeah, these were actually mostly pretty fun. There was only one or two that were kind of a drag. The biggest complaint I have with some of them was that they just were too long. Like, they did not need to be as long as they were, but for the most part, these were pretty impressive. I like most of these. Good stuff, guys. I'd like to see more. I enjoy watching some fan films sometimes. They're not one of my favorite things to check out because a lot of them are bad. But I picked out some of the ones here that I thought were pretty sharp. Let me know if you've seen any of these. Let me know which of these you like, which of them you don't like, which of them recommend me some other ones that you think are excellent. I'd like to see those in the comments below. Tell me some of the other Friday fan films. And maybe we'll do another video on these coming up with some of the other, like the Nightmare on Elm Street fan films. Maybe we'll do some Halloween fan films as well, too. We'll check out some of that stuff also. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. If you enjoy the channel, subscribe. If you also enjoy the channel, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines, where you can help keep it going. I'd appreciate that. And otherwise, I'll see you very shortly for another great video. Thanks a lot, guys, and bye-bye.